Jack Tal had seen many horrifying things during his studies at the Galactic University. He had witnessed a Ralk molting in real time, an experience that had left half the class sick. He had observed the Carthian fire trials, where participants walked through scorching embers without so much as a blink. He had even studied the anatomy of the dreaded Xelar devourers, whose nerve clusters could survive being split in two. None of that prepared him for what he saw in the human sector. The lecture hall hummed with hushed conversations as the xenobiology professor, a rigid-limbed Thorian, introduced today's topic, comparative pain tolerance across species. Jarl barely listened. The Thorian had been running the same research for decades, and the conclusions were always the same. Pain perception varied wildly among species, but the ability to endure it correlated with evolutionary necessity. Jarl's own species, the Korin, were sensitive to pain due to their fragile exoskeletons. The reptilian Zikari had a moderate endurance, though their pain tolerance plummeted once their scales were breached. Even the terrifyingly large Orva, whose bodies could withstand vacuum exposure, collapsed in agony when their thick hides were cut. Then there were humans. They were soft. Their bones broke easily. Their skin was thin. Their organs were exposed with minimal effort. They lacked redundant biological systems like the Kethian or the regenerative abilities of the Ralk. Everything about them suggested weakness, and yet the reports from those who had encountered them told a different story. Humans fought through injuries that should have immobilized them. They continued moving, working, even fighting long after other species would have collapsed from sheer agony. Jarl didn't believe most of it. It was one thing to endure pain through biological necessity. It was another to do it willingly. He was about to be proven wrong. Before we begin our analysis of human pain perception, the professor droned, one of your fellow students has volunteered to demonstrate a cultural phenomenon unique to their species. The moment the professor gestured to the side of the room, the atmosphere shifted. Every alien eye turned to the human sitting casually on a chair near the front. It was the first time Jarl had really looked at him. The woman's name was Callum, though Jarl had never spoken to him beyond the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. Callum was unremarkable. He wasn't the largest human Jarl had seen, nor the most muscular. His posture was relaxed, as if this entire situation was nothing but an amusing side project. A machine hummed to life beside him, a device that looked like a fusion of a precision injector and a surgical drill. The operator, another human with metal embedded in his skin, rolled up Callum's sleeve, revealing his bare arm. The professor cleared his throat. Today, we will observe what humans refer to as tattooing, a process in which they inject pigment directly into their dermis using needles. This procedure is performed for personal or cultural reasons, often voluntarily. Jarl's mandibles twitched. Needles? Callum grinned. Lots of them. Before anyone could react, the machine pressed against his skin. The sharp buzz echoed in the silent hall as the needle pierced him again and again, rapidly puncturing his arm with surgical precision. Jarl's stomach twisted. The ink spread beneath the human skin, forming dark patterns as the needle worked. Callum didn't flinch. Jarl's claws flexed against his chair. He had seen creatures endure pain before, but there was always a reaction, a twitch, a hiss of discomfort, a barely perceptible wince. Callum did none of that. The Zikari sitting nearby leaned forward. "That does not hurt?" "Nah," Callum replied. "Feels kinda nice after a while." Jarl turned sharply. "That's a lie," Callum chuckled. "I mean, it's not comfortable, but you get used to it." Jarl's mind reeled. This was unnecessary pain. It served no biological function. There was no survival advantage. The human was allowing himself to be repeatedly stabbed for no reason other than personal preference. It wasn't just tolerance. It was something else entirely. The buzzing continued, and the aliens watched in stunned silence. Even the professor, who had surely seen this before, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then Callum spoke again. "This is nothing, really. You should see the ones that go over bone." Jarl felt his stomach churn. Jarl had always prided himself on understanding pain. It was a universal constant, the great limit that dictated survival. Every species respected it, feared it, avoided it. Even the most resilient life forms had thresholds they dared not cross. Humans, however, seemed to treat it as a mild inconvenience. The tattoo machine continued its relentless buzzing, each tiny puncture delivering a fresh dose of ink beneath Callum's skin. Jarl tracked every movement, analysing the rhythm, the precision, the sheer number of times that needle drove itself into human flesh. Callum remained seated, perfectly at ease. He even had the audacity to lean back slightly, as if this were no more concerning than a routine medical scan. Jarl wasn't the only one disturbed. Across the room, a Zikari had partially raised the spines along his neck, a defensive response usually reserved for direct threats. The Orve beside him had shifted away, his large frame tensed as if bracing for a second-hand shock. Even the Thorian professor, known for his detached academic demeanour, looked unusually still. The tattooist, unfazed, wiped excess ink from Callum's arm and continued his work. "How long does this process take?" Jarl asked, trying to suppress his growing unease. Callum glanced at the design being etched into his skin. "It depends on the size. Small ones take maybe 20 minutes. Big ones can take hours, sometimes multiple sessions." "Hours?" Jarl echoed. "Yeah, one done on my back took 2 full days." The Zikari's spines shot up further. 2 cycles of sustained injury. Callum shrugged. Slept fine afterward. Jarl struggled to process this information. 2 days of what should have been excruciating pain. Repeated punctures, stretching skin to its limits. Layers of trauma deliberately inflicted over and over. And the human had gone to sleep as if nothing had happened. Jarl's exoskeletal fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. "Your species claims to feel pain as we do. How can you endure it so casually?" Callum gave him a thoughtful look. "It's not that we don't feel it, we just deal with it differently." "This is not dealing with it. This is reckless self-inflicted harm." Callum laughed. "Nah, it's just art." Jarl struggled to suppress a shudder. Pain was never art. Pain was nature's warning system, a barrier between existence and destruction. If a Koran suffered an injury, it demanded immediate attention. If a Zikari took a deep wound, it signalled retreat. If an Orve was harmed, it was an emergency. For humans, it was apparently an afternoon hobby. Callum lifted his arm slightly, examining the progress. "Besides, this isn't even close to the worst we go through." Jarl's mandibles twitched. "Explain." Callum set his arm back down, smirking. "We train ourselves to push through pain. Athletes, fighters, soldiers, people condition their bodies to take hits and keep going." The Orve rumbled from his seat. "Why?" Callum's face took on a casual seriousness. "Because sometimes stopping isn't an option." Jarl's stomach twisted. That answer was too simple, too casual for what it implied. The Thorian professor finally interjected. "Are you saying your species has trained itself to ignore biological imperatives?" "Not ignore, more override," Callum corrected. "Pain still works. It still tells us something's wrong. But if we need to push through it, we can." Jarl leaned forward. "For how long?" Callum's smirk widened slightly. "Depends." Jarl waited, but no further explanation came. The ambiguity made it worse. He turned his attention back to the tattoo. The design was beginning to take shape, a set of interlocking lines and symbols, the meaning of which was lost on him. The process should have been unbearable, yet Callum remained entirely unbothered. The Zikari tilted his head. "Is this the only instance of voluntary pain your species engages in?" Callum snorted. "Not even close." The room grew tense. Broken bones, muscle tears, extreme burns, Callum continued. People push through all kinds of things. We even have endurance sports built around it. Marathons, triathlons, ultramarathons. Some people run for days straight, even when their bodies want to give out. Jal processed that information carefully. But why? Callum tilted his head. Why do you climb mountains? Jal stiffened. I do not climb mountains. Callum laughed. Fair, but humans do. Even when it's dangerous, even when their bodies are screaming at them to stop. Sometimes it's about the challenge. Sometimes it's about proving something to yourself. Sometimes it's just because you want to see what's on the other side. Giles' mind reeled. That logic made no sense. Evolution favoured self-preservation. Every intelligent species avoided unnecessary risk, unnecessary suffering. Humans sought it out. The buzzing of the machine finally stopped. Callum flexed his arm, inspecting the finished design. He nodded approvingly, then glanced around at the stunned faces in the room. Anyone else want one? Silence. Giles' claws tightened against his chair. He had always thought of humans as soft. Now he wasn't so sure. Giles could not shake the feeling that something fundamental about human nature had been revealed. Something that defied every logical framework he had ever known. Callum, a being with no exoskeleton, no redundant organs, no pain resistance to speak of, had willingly subjected himself to repeated injury, all in the name of what he called art. And yet, the more Giles thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about tattoos. This was about something deeper. Your species has an unnatural relationship with pain, he finally said. Callum laughed, rolling his freshly inked arm back down over his sleeve. I guess that's one way to put it. Giles studied him carefully. You override your own limits. You push beyond natural thresholds. But you do not simply endure suffering. You claim to embrace it. Callum leaned forward slightly. Not all pain is bad, Jack. Joel recoiled at the casual shortening of his name, but Callum continued before he could protest. You see pain as a warning, a survival mechanism, something to be avoided. Callum gestured at his arm. But we don't just run from it. We turn it into something else. It's part of how we grow. We train our bodies to endure more, our minds to push through obstacles. And sometimes, we make it into art. Giles' mandibles twitched. But why create art from suffering? Callum tilted his head slightly, thinking. Because pain tells a story. He tapped his arm. This is a reminder. Some people get tattoos to remember where they've been, what they've been through. Some mark victories, some mark losses. Every scar, every line, every ink design, it means something. Giles thought of his own people. Corrins had no permanent markings, no bodily records of their past hardships. Their bodies healed cleanly, erasing injuries as though they had never happened. The idea of keeping a visible mark deliberately was completely foreign. Callum smirked. I knew a guy back on Earth who got a tattoo after breaking his leg. He had to wear a cast for months, barely able to walk. After he healed, he got a design that looked like metal bars wrapping around his bone. Giles narrowed his eyes. You commemorate wounds. Sometimes. Callum flexed his arm. Pain is proof we were here, that we survived. Giles didn't respond immediately. He had always seen pain as a barrier, something that divided the strong from the weak, the living from the dying. But Callum spoke of it differently. Humans transform pain into something else entirely. Across the room, the Zikari finally spoke. Your species chooses to suffer so that you may remember suffering? Callum shrugged. We choose to remember that we made it through. Joel glanced around the room. The Orve still looked uneasy, his heavy form shifting as if the weight of the conversation had grown unbearable. The Thorian professor observed with his usual detachment, though his limbs were unusually stiff. Jarl wasn't sure if the others understood the gravity of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just an odd human tradition. It was a glimpse into a mindset that defied reason. Humans did not just tolerate pain. They conquered it, reshaped it, gave it meaning. Jarl's claws twitched slightly against the desk. "Would you ever get one?" Callum asked suddenly. Jarl stiffened. "A tattoo?" Callum grinned. "Yeah, you could get something cool, maybe some kind of Quran symbol." Jarl looked down at his own exoskeletal arms. His kind did not scar. They did not heal in a way that left marks. His body would always return to its original state, no matter what. But now, for the first time, he wondered what it would be like to leave something permanent behind, something that did not fade, something that proved he had endured. Jarl looked back at Callum's arm, at the ink that now marked him forever. Then, without thinking, he muttered, "Perhaps." Callum grinned. "Let me know when you're ready." The buzzing of the tattoo machine had long since stopped, but in Jarl's mind something had only just begun. Jarl had always believed that time would help him forget the strange human phenomenon he had witnessed. The way Callum had let the tattoo machine puncture his skin without hesitation. The way he spoke of pain as if it were an old companion rather than an enemy. These were things that should have faded from memory with the passing of days. But they didn't. Long after that day in the lecture hall, Jarl found himself thinking about it more than he cared to admit. He was an academic, a being who thrived on logic and the pursuit of knowledge. Yet no logical framework could fully explain what he had seen. The idea of pain being something to seek out, something to embrace rather than fear, gnawed at the foundations of his understanding. One day he sought Callum out. He found the human in one of the university's common areas, lounging in the artificial light, scrolling through his data pad. When Jarl approached, Callum grinned, setting his pad down. "Well, if it isn't my favourite Corrin. What brings you here?" Jarl hesitated, then asked, "Do you regret it?" Callum raised an eyebrow. "Regret what?" "The tattoo, the pain, the permanence." Callum laughed, shaking his head. "Not even a little." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the ink that had been embedded in his skin. "Every time I see it, I remember why I got it. It's a part of me now." Jarl studied the intricate markings. He had spent weeks researching human tattoo traditions after the demonstration, but reading about it was nothing compared to seeing it up close. The tattoo wasn't just a symbol, it was a deliberate scar, a memory carved into flesh that would never fade. Jarl's mandibles twitched. "I have considered your words, the idea that pain can be transformed into something meaningful, that it can be a mark of survival." Callum nodded. "It can be a lot of things, a reminder, a challenge, even just a piece of art. But yeah, for some of us, it's about surviving." Jarl hesitated before speaking again. "If I were to undergo such a procedure, what would you suggest?" Callum's eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and excitement. "You're serious?" Jarl exhaled slowly. "I am." Callum leaned forward. "All right. Well, first things first. What do you want it to mean?" Jarl had never considered that. His people had never marked their bodies for symbolic purposes. The idea of choosing something permanent, something that would last beyond even his own ability to regenerate, was both daunting and strangely exhilarating. "Proof," Jarl said at last. "Proof that I understand." Callum's grin widened. "Now that I can work with—" It was 2 weeks later that Jarl sat in the chair, his arm extended as the tattooist prepared the machine. His exoskeleton was harder than human skin, and the process would be different. But Callum had found a specialist willing to make it happen. Jarl braced himself as the machine whirred to life. The first puncture was sharp, a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. His body instinctively recoiled, but he forced himself to stay still. He had studied pain tolerance, understood its mechanics, but he had never willingly subjected himself to it before. The process was slow, each puncture a deliberate mark on his body. Callum sat beside him, watching with a knowing expression. "Hurts, doesn't it?" Jarl exhaled. "Yes." Callum chuckled. "Good." As the tattooist continued his work, Jarl felt something unexpected. The pain, though sharp, became rhythmic. It did not fade, but his body adapted, his mind adjusting to the new experience. He thought about the humans who endured worse, who ran marathons on torn muscles, who climbed mountains with frostbitten limbs, who pressed forward despite every instinct telling them to stop. By the time it was finished, Jarl felt different. He looked down at the mark now embedded in his exoskeleton. A simple design, yet unmistakable in its significance. He had done something no Corrin had ever done before. He had chosen to keep the pain. Callum clapped him on the back. "Welcome to the club." Jarl flexed his arm, feeling the new weight of the symbol. It would not heal, would not vanish with time. And for the first time he understood why that was a good thing. Pain was not just something to endure. It was something to remember. And in that remembrance, something new was born. Jarl looked at Callum and nodded. "I understand now."